Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to all the viewers of Summit TV, to the Banking Summit of 2012 organized by the Banking Association South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon is going to be hot topic that's going to be discussed about the role that finance institutions as well as the banking industry can play in private and public partnerships. And this morning we hope to be hearing from you exactly what that robust debate is going to be about, what are some of the topics that are going to be discussed, what it is you expect from government, what government is expecting from the banking society, but also what it is that we are expecting from government and what role can be played by all partners.
This summit provides a platform for all key stakeholders to ask some tough questions and critical questions and formulate coherent proposals with a view to making South Africa Inc. succeed and prosper. If you look at the challenges that are highlighted in the NDP, together we can achieve to increase the investment, for instance, in the country to a benchmark of 10% of GDP in terms of infrastructure as enunciated in the NDP. And if we are successful and agree on the implementation program for the NDP, we must move forward in addressing the challenges of more inclusive growth. We can address the challenges of poverty, unemployment, education, health, as well as sustained economic growth. Historically, the funding for infrastructure in this country was the exclusive mandate of government. And it is only in recent years that we've started to see the private sector being involved in a number of projects. I can name a few of them: the Gautrain, the Stadia, and so on, the power generation projects that we see in the country. But clearly, it's quite important that we continue on this path of partnership between the private sector and government. In this country, Deputy Minister, the banking sector stands ready to partner with the government at all levels to ensure that the infrastructure that is required is funded.
I want to also applaud and commend the Banking Association South Africa for having convened this summit. There couldn't have been a better time to do this when the country needs to embark on its infrastructure and actually accelerate its infrastructure development program. Last Wednesday, the National Planning Commission presented its final report to the President in Parliament. The document summarizes a long process of introspection. It sets out a vision of South Africa in 2030. It eloquently speaks to the desire for all South Africans to have a country with world-class schooling, world-class healthcare, and public infrastructure to support development. This National Development Plan makes some very important observations about the path between now and 2030. The most important and perhaps the opportunities and challenges of our changing demography. In particular, the plan notes that we have arrived at a sweet spot, as they put it, in the demographic transition. The population has a proportionally high number of working age people and a proportionally low number of young and old. In contrast to Europe and other developed countries, South Africa is young and vibrant, a perfect window for growth, as it puts it. This presents an enormous opportunity, but is an enormous challenge as well. Many of these young South Africans are without work. The NDP warns that, and I quote, "If not managed, the perfect window could become a perfect storm. South Africans between the ages of 15 and 29 will make up more than a quarter of the total population until 2030. So what should we do, ladies and gentlemen? Again, the NDP proposes some concrete steps. At the heart of the future, we dream of its infrastructure, talking about schools, roads, hospitals, and trains. Infrastructure development is a crucial part of raising South Africa's potential growth rate. A 1 percentage point increase in infrastructure investment will, by some estimates, raise long-run GDP by about 1.3% and employment by about 0.7%. Government has identified potential projects worth about 3.2 trillion rands between now and 2020. Our infrastructure plan creates huge opportunities for banks to contribute to the building of our nation. Long-term profitability requires a long-term vision, and banks need to lend long-term. Lending for consumption might be profitable in the short term, but it's not sustainable, we all know.
Hi, my name is Vuyo Jack from EmpowerDex. The question that I have is that when you look at infrastructure, effectively it is the youth who ultimately pay the price for the infrastructure. And so the question is, what institutional mechanisms are going to be put in place to ensure, number one, that the youth do have a say in what kind of infrastructure that is going to be built. Number two, that they're going to be involved in the implementation. And three, in terms of the maintenance of that infrastructure. Because ultimately, they're the ones who pay for this infrastructure that is created.
At all stages, it is actually a government policy that we empower those that otherwise are left out of the mainstream economy, including women and youth, and an integral part of the people excluded. But there is also the youth employment strategy on the table as we speak that seeks to address youth unemployment. And as the NDP correctly points out, that if that section of society is alienated, then we are treading dangerous ground. So government is actually, all government departments have been urged to ensure that the youth are taken on board.
Minister, my name is Alistair Smith. I'm the Executive Director at NEDLAC, where we have had a couple of engagements around the infrastructure plan and program. And we often talk about finance as a critical constraint as well as human capital. The other constraint, I think, recently that we're starting to pay more attention to is the issue of social capital. Now, in most of the engagements that I've been, one of the issues that's always raised is that of dialogue and conversation and trust. And what concerns me is that, and I think the Marikana issue has brought this tragically to the fore, is that there's very little conversation between the social partners, and there's very little honest conversation between the social partners. And I'm wondering if the Minister has got any thoughts on how we can begin to have that dialogue and to have that real conversation, and what role institutions like NEDLAC can play in that conversation.
There needs to be integrity from all sides. And it has taken some doing to get to where we are with the situation we are at. So we all have to actually do some introspection. From government side, from civil society side, from business, we actually need to come, in order for honesty to prevail in a dialogue, we first all have to be honest with ourselves.
Like many South Africans have been anxious around the government's full commitment towards the implementation of the NDP. We can debate at length whether they have the government has sufficient implementation capacity, funding, or an understanding of what the true cost of that infrastructure program is going to be, more likely to be more than 3.2 trillion. However, the encouraging aspect of it is the commitment that he has put his government in implementing the NDP plans.
The new growth path, which is one of the critical drivers of the infrastructure program that we're looking at, and the National Development Plan emphasizes that, considers the first jobs driver to be the infrastructure program. And given the unemployment situation we have in the country, the Deputy Minister referred to the fact that the majority of unemployed are youth. Obviously, we have to roll this infrastructure program out in a way that does create jobs. But projections up to 2013 is that infrastructure spend as a percentage of GDP would go down from 9.1% to 8.1%, unless we make a significant intervention in this. And I think that what we should be talking about today is how, as South Africa, we can make a significant intervention in this, and as the different stakeholders in society. The NGP, together with the NDP, identify the number of blockages. Again, the Deputy Minister referred to some of these. The one is weak implementation capacity. And it's not a secret. Government does experience challenges of implementation. And we need to see how we can come together to address that. While discussions are happening at a rhetorical level to a certain extent and at a fairly high level, we do have a concern that real engagement with the private sector, and particularly we believe the financial sector, is lacking. So I think that we need to get to a stage where the financial sector is not just considered as a stakeholder, but considered as a strategic partner in actually enabling these infrastructure projects to be sustainable. Because the reality is that we need to find sustainable funding models for these projects. It's got to be a critical part of the sustainability of these projects. We would prefer to engage before costings and models have been looked at for financing, so that we bring in private sector capacity, we bring in private sector skills, we put on the table right up front what is sustainable from the private sector investment point of view, and we begin to actually have some hard discussions around those issues.
One of the areas that within this infrastructure debate that's been worrying us is there's been a lot of talk around prescribed assets, where certain departments in government are talking about forcing pension funds to put in a certain percentage of their investments into infrastructure. The concern we have with that is that money then goes into an amorphous pot and we have no control, no involvement in the whole process. If the truth be told, we are, as an industry, we've invested over 700 billion into infrastructure by virtue of investing into government bonds, parastatal bonds and the like. And this represents 16% of our assets under management. If we look at infrastructure investments, the nature of those investments, for us they are very attractive and far from being needing to be forced to make investments into these areas, we see them as highly desirable assets. They need to ensure regulatory stability. The kind of debacle that we've had over Sunrail doesn't do investment confidence any good. If you promise that this is how an entity is going to be funded, where the cash flows are going to emanate from, if they aren't realized, then you aren't going to be attracting people to make those investments. From an ASISA perspective, what we have done is we've set up an infrastructure investment working group, and it's comprised of all the major investors, all the major asset managers and life officers participating in this process with us, where we want to coordinate the efforts of our industry together with that of the banking industry to ensure that we interact with government in a cohesive kind of way. So really they're supporting what you've had to say over here.
For me, I think this is a very important dialogue that we begin to have. And actually, it really speaks to government having a closer relationship with the private sector at the early stages, like it was already indicated. We've learned our lessons with ESCOM. We've seen the private sector come to the party, which was quite commendable in terms of the building of and the funding of the Medupi, and now with Kusile. So we do hope that this partnership going forward, it will be strengthened and enhanced.
You know, the first thing that the country needs is essentially to have a long-term plan which shapes actual practice. And it doesn't have to be a perfect plan. The National Development Plan, which has been just put forward, won't be implemented 100%, we know that. It's not going to be perfect, there'll be problems with it. But that and the Presidential Infrastructure Coordinated Commission, which has got now a program, between those two, it becomes absolutely important to have something that shapes a long-term purpose for the country. One of the things will be to look at the strategic economic purpose of the projects. We're going to have to sift through those projects. The trains is a good example, where as we procure the trains, we want to be able to ensure we have local content for the trains. So those trains are also made locally, and maybe I'll say something about that later on. And of course, in terms of operations and maintenance, huge opportunities there for jobs and so on. Second thing we find is how do you execute the plan? And you know, if we look at the rest of the world and just look at the region, SADC region, the rest of Africa, what we find is that African firms come up against package deals. You know, it's not just one company going to get a contract, it's a whole consortium from that country. And this, I think, begins to explain, you know, what's the different roles and responsibilities between our institutions. So what should a DFI like DBSA do? What should the government do? Typically, a DFI would be the first to go into these programs, first to enter. Risky projects, strategic projects, but where you need project preparation facilities. Someone must put in the money to do the feasibility. If it doesn't work out, you haven't lost your shirt as a private sector company, but you know, someone's taking it on. The third thing which we need to do, which I think probably is the most important one and is a bit of a showstopper, is if you look at things like infrastructure, they really are things that require you have a high degree of positive certainty. So certainty, but in a positive way, because you want to go and support it. As my colleague from Assisa mentioned, the pension funds, institutional savers, do want to put their money in there, but it has to be in a way that the risk profile must be right. So you want to increase the positive certainty, at the same time you want to be able to manage and reduce the risk. And that talks to the issue of trust and partnership. It links to the issue of the social accord, economic accord that we heard in terms of NEDLAC, and so on. If that is not there, you will find it is very difficult to mobilize the partnerships in practice to support a 20 to 30 year long-term liability sort of program. There are things where you may not have the actual cash in the system. If I look at, let's say, municipalities and water, many of the municipalities are not going to be able to take on debt financing for their infrastructure, simply because they don't have the revenue streams in there to actually do it. But they're using water, which is very expensive, and it's a national resource. And what we might find is what you'd have to start with these municipalities is to help them have the systems in place and the capacity to manage this national resource better, because there's a cost to it, you know, there's value. So, for instance, if you could work with the municipalities to first plug the leaks, deal with their revenue collection systems in terms of water, you would be able to make a big contribution. What we find is typically, you know, municipalities or South Africa as a whole, we have about 35% of our water is unaccounted for water. That means it's either leaking or there's no bill sent out. And in a water-scarce country, that's a hugely important thing, because when it comes down to later on us having water for the mining industry and power stations and the rest, we've got to take that same water.
On the revenue collection and maintenance and so on, I agree with Ravi. I think there's a lot of work to be done in creating a platform for municipalities to actually perform in the infrastructure or participate in the infrastructure build program. And I think there's a role for the private sector to play. At the end of the day, it's about getting systems to work. Let's cut through all the other nonsense and get down to where the problem is. It's about getting systems to work. It's being able to bill people. It's being able to collect. There's a whole range of issues about poverty and indigence and so on, but we need to begin to identify and compartmentalize that properly and then service the rest efficiently. And I think the private sector can play a role in that.
According to the National Budgetary Review, National Treasury's Budget Review of 2012, only 62%, up to 62% of the current projects underway are pre-financing and pre-construction. That's massive. That is where the role of the private sector can really add value in terms of looking at those projects beyond the infrastructure or the construction phase. Because as the private sector, we understand the critical role repayment has to play in establishing the suitability of those projects upfront. 2012, only 68% of the allocated infrastructure spend was actually expended by government. That talks to an inability to have the adequate implementation capacity. Again, a superb role that the private sector can play in facilitating those implementations with national government, or rather with government departments?
At the end of the day, I think that the state has got to create the environment for the private sector to invest in areas where the private sector can take the risk, and there are returns for the private sector, and there's a return on the investment. Where I begin to have a problem is that where there's an assumption in some parts of government that the private sector is not patriotic and does not want to invest in our country. And therefore, state-owned institutions need to come into areas where the private sector should be investing, or we need to form more state-owned institutions. So there's been talk about, state bank or state mining company and so on. What we would want to see is a state that intervenes in areas and in markets that are too risky for the private sector, works with the private sector to actually create a hybrid of funding for those markets, if funding is necessary, addresses the underlying factors that make those markets not working, which make those markets dysfunctional, and once we've addressed that, to move off.
I think in terms of what we're trying to achieve is that we're saying to our state-owned companies, it's going to be business unusual. And for you to achieve this, we have to make sure that we also begin to set targets that will increase capacity and capability to take on these projects. But for them to do that, as we set these targets, they must do that in partnership with the private sector in order to share the risk, to make sure that these projects actually do get implemented and the risk sharing and the returns are actually there.
I think we've heard earlier on that the total infrastructure spend is likely to be in the order of 3.2 trillion rands. Most of it is spent in what we call economic and social investments or social assets. They vary quite significantly. I have some quick stats to share with you on that one. We are likely to spend about 74 billion on water, which would be a social investment, about 110 billion on health, 185 billion on education, which we all agree in the room is much needed. About 1.9 billion, or rather 1.9 trillion on electricity, as was earlier alluded to. For us, I think as a firm, the real contention is how this project will be rolled out. There is uncertainty around how government is going to fund, despite earlier comments by the Deputy Minister of Finance that about 840 billion has already been funded off the balance sheet of SOEs. There's a significant gap to 3.2 trillion. The time for dialogue and debate has to come to an end. For us, as a public, there needs to be action, proper action implemented around some of the ideas that we've talked about earlier this morning.
I think we need to walk the talk. We pull the summit together. And I think as a follow-up, what we will commit to do is we will, at least to start with, pull together ourselves, the CSAR, DPE, and the DBSA. And let's just have an initial discussion on how we actually move forward concretely on these issues.
We keep talking about the 3.2 trillion that's out there that needs to be funded. But that is a huge number in anybody's context. But I think the reality is that the bulk of it's probably going to be coming from government's coffers, some from the state-owned enterprises themselves. And to me, the important bit for us over here is what is the chunk that the private sector is going to be involved with? And I think the sooner we can get to trying to identify those where we can start having a look and engaging on the specifics, the quicker we're going to be able to actually achieve something.
In terms of projects, we need to be specific. We take that away to say we're going to be looking at the projects very closely, interrogating it together with the colleagues to help us to prioritize and to make sure that these projects do happen. So as a start, I think this is a very good start. We're getting the feedback from the private sector. We begin to engage, to share challenges, and we need to also share lessons learned in order to build a better country for all of us. Thanks.
Essentially, 75% of the 3.2 trillion rand PICC program still has to go through some sort of feasibility. But at the end, you can be sure there'll be a substantial program that will still come through that. And I think what we should also do is that apart from that, we have in the region very large requirements as well to add to that. Now, so there's huge needs and opportunities in the region, and I think it'll be important then to look at how a joint program can be smashed together.
It's been an absolute pleasure having all the viewers of Summit TV with us, and we hope that this debate does in fact carry on not only from government but also from the private sector in creating an environment where South Africa does succeed.